Let me speak to some of the key concepts and terminologies that are always confusing to the student of military history and, of course, strategic studies. And it is no other concept than policy, tactics, and strategy. Are they the same thing? Are they similar? And what are the similarities and differences, if any? For us to have a very clear understanding of what we want to look at, and before we can conclude to determine whether they are the same, they're different, or they have similarities and differences, we have to first of all, understand the key concepts first. And the first one is policy. Then the question is, what is policy in military studies? Policy is nothing but the broad principle, the political principle, the objectives, the guidelines that is formulated by a government or that is formulated by a political authority to direct national interest. In military affairs, it is policy that determines why a war is fought. What kind of national interests are to be protected in a war? In military studies, policy as a concept is nothing but guidelines, things that protect, the procedures, the laid down rules, the regulations that guide the conduct of a particular war that a nation has decided to found itself in. The key characteristics of policy in military studies are: one, it must be politically oriented, and it must go with the interest of that nation, the national interest, and it is always broad and long term. It is policy that guides the military and the diplomatic actions of a state. For example, a national defense policy is always aimed at protecting territorial sovereignty of nations. That's a policy. One of the policies of Nigeria is to ensure security and alliance building, especially in the sub-region we have found ourselves, West Africa. Nigeria's policy of regional peacekeeping in West Africa through ECOWAS is a very good example. I've just explained the concept of policy within the broader perspective of military studies. Now let's talk about strategy. Strategy is nothing but the art and science of employing military, economic, political, and diplomatic resources to achieve the laid down aims and objectives of a nation. It has to do with the overall conduct of war and the coordination of national power to achieve victory. When we say strategy, we are talking about deploying all sorts of resources, be it military resources, economic resources, technological resources, and all kind of resources to achieve, overall success. And most times it's long term. In fact, strategy as a concept has levels, one of which is grand strategy. When you are talking of grand strategy in military studies, you are talking about the coordination of all national instruments of power. Oh, we can say Nigeria is adopting grand strategy in its fight against Boko Haram. What that means is that Nigeria is deploying is bringing out all its instrument of power. And when we say instrument of power, we're talking about military power, we're talking about economic power, diplomatic power, and even informational power to achieve national objective. Strategy as a concept in military studies is one, long term, and it is always comprehensive. When military professionals, when warlords come together, sit down on a table to design a strategy for their operations, in most cases it is long term and it is comprehensive, and it focuses on achieving military objectives. The only objective of a strategy in military studies is to achieve an objective, and it coordinates national resources. They have to coordinate the resources of the nation to achieve the objective. Then it determines the overall direction of that military campaign. How do we channel our resources? What is the objectives of this fight? How do we go about winning this war? You see the similarity, the differences, or let me say the collaboration between strategy and policy is that it bridges the policy and battlefield operations. For example, during the Second World War, the Allied strategy during that war to defeat Germany before focusing on Japan, they wanted to, that's a strategy. Let us defeat Germany before we now focus on Japan. That was what the Allied forces did to achieve their objectives. And it's a strategy. It's a what? It's a strategy. The strategy of containment adopted by the United States during the Cold War is also a strategy. What do I mean by containment? Do not allow USSR to spread, because if they spread, they will cause trouble and you might not be able to contain them in future. That's a strategy. You can decide that, okay, let us surround Boko Haram, let us surround Sambisa forest so that Boko Haram will not spread outside the forest. That's a strategy. And after the soldiers of Nigeria have surrounded the Sambisa forest, then you now start combing. You now start combing the forest to make sure they don't spread, and you can easily, combat and defeat them. That's a strategy. Another example of strategy can be naval blockade strategy that is aimed at weakening enemy economies. It's a strategy you can decide to use a strategy of, let's block the naval waterways of our enemies so that they will not be carrying goods across the route to be economically strong so that they cannot fight again. I can come back to Nigeria and use another example to say that, look, one of the strategies adopted by the federal government of Nigeria against the Biafra was the policy of starvation. Federal government of Nigeria decided to cut the supply of food from the eastern part of Nigeria. No truck can take food products into the east. And that's a strategy. The essence of that strategy is to make sure that, look, by the time the people of Biafra became so hungry, they cannot carry arms to go and fight, and they will surrender. And that strategy worked perfectly. That was why many of our Biafra brothers, when there were no food to eat, they started hunting for lizard rats in the bushes, and when those rats finished, they started eating themselves. Cannibalism. They couldn't have red oil to cook their soup, and they decided to start taking white soup. That's history of white soup. Because there's no oil to put inside this thing. Some people now say, I want white soup. The reason why there's white, people started taking white soup was because there was no oil to put into their soups. You can imagine. The strategy was to make sure these people become so hungry that they cannot face Nigerian government in a battle. That's a strategy. Simple. Then the last concept now is tactics. And the question is, what is tactics? It is nothing but, when they say tactics, when footballers mention, oh, let's adopt so and so tactics, they are talking about specific, please underline, specific battlefield actions, specific battlefield methods, specific battlefield techniques that is always used by the military unit to achieve immediate objectives. The difference between strategy and tactics here now is the duration. While strategy can be long-term plans, then tactics is immediate action. You don't even plan those ones as much as possible. Sometimes you don't plan some of the tactics. When you are on the field fighting as soldiers, certain situations will demand that you adopt some immediate methods. Those methods you are adopting while you are on the field fighting as a soldier is called tactics. Tactics has to do with the maneuvering of soldiers, the troops, the use of weapons, some surprise attacks, some ambushes. You know what I mean by unexpected ambushes, and some battlefield, arrangements to make sure enemies are defeated. So from this explanation now, you can see that one of the characteristics of tactics is that tactics are short term and they are operational. And apart from that, tactics focus on immediate battlefield success. When they are talking about tactics, just know that immediate, right now. What can we do right away? Enemies are coming. How do we strike and defeat them? That's tactics for you. And tactics are flexible and they are situation dependent. You can't draw all the tactics before you come to the field because you don't know how your enemies want to operate. So that's why I said tactics can be flexible and they depend on the situation the soldiers found themselves. You may come to the you may have a tactics in mind and you get to the battlefield and your tactics change. For example, like I said, example of tactics, ambush operations against enemy patrols. Maybe you are on your way, you saw enemies coming, you can lay ambush for them. That's a tactics to make sure they are defeated. And apart from that, you can make use of airstrike before ground offensives. Like the tactics of Nigerian forces against the military Sambisa forest can be, first of all, the government should fly a fighter jet around the forest, drop some weapons, and you see the Boko Haram running scatter outside the forest. And they won't know that there are ground forces surrounding to deal with those ones. That's a tactic. Now the question again, we go back to the question. What is the relationship now between policy, strategy, and tactics? Let's start from there. From what you have heard from me, policy, strategy, and tactics, they form hierarchical shape in military strategy and strategic studies. Number one, it is policy that determines the objectives. It is policy that determines the national interest, the objectives, the reason why countries must go into certain war. Now, it is strategy, therefore, that translate policy into plans. Whereas I used to call tactics as executive kind of strategy, because military commanders and troops apply tactical methods on the battlefield so that they can achieve immediate, objectives, so that they can achieve immediate goals. Policy of conclusively, to summarize the whole story, you must have seen that a lot of similarities exist between the two concepts, whereas there are differences. For example, they have policy is broad political guideline, whereas strategy is broader, overall plan for achieving political objectives or a particular objective in a state, whereas tactics is nothing but battlefield method. So the one you deployed while you are fighting is what? Tactics. Policy's whole essence is to achieve political or national interest, whereas strategy is to command, and of course tactics is operational, battlefield. The whole essence of policy, like I mentioned, is national interest. The whole essence of strategy is to win wars and campaign, whereas the whole essence of tactics is to win battles. There's a difference between wars and battles. You can win a battle and you didn't win a war. So those who sit down to plan and they have the intention of not only win the battle, they want to win the battle and at the same time win the war, so they have a strategy. The essence of the strategy is to make sure you win wars and win campaigns. Then when you don't have tactics, you win battles. It is better to win wars than to win battles. You can win a battle and not win a war. Let me talk about the time frame now. Policy is long term when it comes to time frame. Strategy is medium term, whereas tactics is short term. I'm trying to explain again now. When you design policy can be something you want to achieve in 10 years' time. But when it comes to strategy, that can be medium, maybe, okay, what do you want to achieve in 3 months, 6 months, 9 months in this fight? Whereas the tactics cannot be, what are we likely to achieve now. Policy is formulated by political leaders. That's very key now. Whereas strategy cannot be formulated by political leaders. Tinubu can formulate policy, but Tinubu cannot formulate strategy. Policy is formulated by political leaders. Strategy is formulated by military commanders. Some military commanders does not go to the battlefield. Okay? Whereas tactics is done by the field commanders that are able to go to the battlefield. Thank you very much.